A family sold a commercial property for $350,000 until an appraiser revealed it was worth $1.5 million. Now the entire family is threatening to sue, and my girlfriend blames me for tearing them apart. The building on Callaway Street didn't look like much. It never had. It was a squat, single-story commercial space. Brick face, flat roof. The kind of structure that a mid-century architect designed on a Tuesday afternoon and probably forgot about by Wednesday. The awning out front had been replaced twice in 70 years, and the current one, a faded green canvas affair, had been there long enough to become part of the neighborhood's background noise. People walked past it every day without seeing it. The hardware store that used to occupy it closed sometime in the 90s. After that came a tax preparation service that lasted 8 years, then a chiropractor, then a small insurance office, then nothing. For the past 4 years, it had been leased to a shipping and printing franchise that paid $2,800 a month and kept to themselves. Nobody, least of all the family that owned it, thought of it as anything special. That was the first mistake. The Harmon family had owned that building since 1953, when Gerald Harmon Sr., a man who believed in bricks over banks, purchased it with money he'd saved working double shifts at the rail yard and doing weekend carpentry jobs across 3 counties. Gerald Sr. was not an educated man, but he was a deliberate one. He didn't trust stock certificates or savings accounts. He trusted things he could put his hand on. And so he put his hand on a piece of commercial property in the center of a small but growing southern town, paid $4,200 for it, and told his wife it was going to be their family's foundation. He wasn't wrong. He just couldn't have known what foundation really meant. Gerald Sr. brought 2 of his sons into the business. A loose arrangement they formalized with handshakes and a single-page document that a notary stamped in 1961. His oldest boy, Raymond, took a 30% stake. His youngest, Dale, took 20%. Gerald held 50% and ran the place himself until his knees gave out in 1967, at which point Raymond took over day-to-day management of the tenants. And the whole arrangement drifted forward on inertia, the way family businesses do when nobody wants to be the one to change anything. Gerald Sr. died in 1971. His 50% was split between the 2 sons, in accordance with a will that a country lawyer had drafted for $35. Raymond and Dale each now owned 50% of a building that, by that point, was generating about $600 a month in rent. They never thought to get an appraisal. Why would they? The building was worth what it was worth. The tax assessor came by every few years, updated the numbers on a form, and that was that. The assessment was the number. It had always been the number. This is the part that matters. The assessment was not the number, but the Harmon family didn't know that. And for the next 5 decades, that ignorance compounded quietly. Like interest on a debt nobody knew they were carrying. Raymond Harmon was not a greedy man. He was, however, a persistent one. He had a wife, 3 kids, a mortgage, and ambitions that a 50% stake in a modest commercial property could not satisfy. By 1974, he'd gotten his real estate license. By 1978, he was managing a dozen properties across the county. The building on Callaway Street was, to him, a sentimental holdover. His father's thing, not his. When Dale mentioned that he could use some cash, his wife was sick, medical bills, the usual cruelties, Raymond made him an offer. He looked up the tax assessment. $14,000 for the full property. Dale's 50% was worth $7,000 by that math. Raymond offered him $8,000, which felt generous at the time, which felt like Raymond looking out for his little brother. Dale took it. He needed the money. He shook Raymond's hand in the kitchen of the house where they'd grown up. And that was that. Raymond now owned 100% of a building that the tax assessment said was worth $14,000. And that was, in reality, already worth considerably more. But nobody looked. Nobody asked. The assessment was the number. Raymond died of a heart attack in 1987. He was 61 years old. He left the property to his wife, Patricia, along with a house that had a second mortgage, 2 cars that needed work, and a life insurance policy that covered the funeral with a little left over. Patricia was not a businesswoman. She was a retired school librarian who grew roses and made the best peach preserves in the county, and had no idea what to do with a commercial property. She called her oldest son, Dennis. Dennis Harmon was 41. Steady, the kind of man who coached youth baseball and always showed up when you called him. He worked as a grocery store manager, had, since he was 23, had worked his way up from bag boy with the methodical patience of someone who understood that slow and reliable beats fast and reckless every time. He wasn't rich. He wasn't poor. He was, in the parlance of his particular American moment, doing okay. He also had a brother. Tommy Harmon, 37, was the opposite of Dennis in nearly every visible way. Charming where Dennis was steady, impulsive where Dennis was deliberate, always between things in a way that Dennis never was. Tommy had a quarter share interest in the property through a side arrangement their father Raymond had documented, but never properly formalized. When Patricia decided she needed to consolidate ownership and get things simple, she and Dennis agreed that Dennis should buy Tommy out. The tax assessment in 1984 had put the property at $38,000. Tommy's informal stake was roughly 25%. The math said $9,500. Dennis paid him $20,000, nearly double, because Tommy had 2 kids and was between jobs again, and because Dennis was, at his core, a decent man. Tommy thanked him. They had a few beers. Dennis became the sole owner of the building on Callaway Street. He never once thought about what it might actually be worth. Dennis managed the property for another decade the way he managed everything. Carefully, without drama, handling maintenance issues when they came up, collecting rent, paying taxes, keeping the records in a manila folder in the filing cabinet beside his desk. When he died, a stroke, 67 years old, gone between one Tuesday and the next. He left everything to his wife, Margaret. Margaret Harmon was 64 when she became a landlord. She had worked as a dental hygienist for 30 years, raised 2 daughters, Carolyn and Beth, in the same house where Dennis had lived his whole adult life, and was now suddenly alone in that house with a commercial property she'd never had to think about before. She was not helpless, but she was overwhelmed. And the first thing she did, as people do when they're overwhelmed, was look for a simple number to hold on to. The tax assessment said the property was worth $312,000. The rent was $2,800 a month. After taxes, insurance, and the occasional maintenance bill, she was clearing maybe $5,000 a year if things went well. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was Dennis's something, and she held on to it with both hands. Her youngest daughter, Beth, had moved out of state for college and stayed, married a man named Jordan, settled into a life a few hours away. Her oldest, Carolyn, had stayed nearby. Neither daughter had any particular interest in the property. It was Mom's thing, Mom's problem, something to deal with eventually. Beth, at some point, started dating me. I want to be careful here, because the story of what happened is not, at its center, about me. But I have to tell you who I am so you understand why I said what I said. I've been working in land and commercial property for about 15 years. Not development mostly, acquisition and evaluation. I know how to read a parcel. I know how to look at a building not as a building, but as a position on a map relative to foot traffic, zoning, surrounding development, projected growth corridors, and about a dozen other factors that don't show up on a tax assessment form. It's not magic. It's just pattern recognition built up over years of doing the work. Beth and I had been together for 2 years when Margaret started talking seriously about selling. I'd heard about the property in passing, family dinner table conversation, the kind of thing that gets mentioned and moved past. It wasn't until Beth sat me down one night and said, "Mom wants to sell, and she thinks she can get $350,000. Does that sound right to you?" That I actually stopped and thought about it. "Where'd she get that number?" I asked. "Property tax assessment," Beth said. I didn't say anything right away. I've learned, in relationships, that the pause before the response matters. But I was already running the calculation in my head. 1 acre of commercial land, center of town, busy street, area that had been developing steadily for the last decade. And something wasn't adding up. "Can you get me the address?" I said. "I'd like to take a look." I drove past it the next day. Stood on the sidewalk for about 5 minutes, walked around the block, looked at what was across the street, what was 2 blocks down, what had opened in the last 3 years, and what was under construction. I checked the zoning on my phone. I looked at recent comparable sales in the county. Then I called Beth. "The tax assessment and the property value are 2 different things," I told her. "The assessment is what the county uses to calculate taxes. It's almost always lower than market value, sometimes significantly. Your mom should not be listing this property based on that number." "How much do you think it's worth?" Beth asked. "I don't know," I said. "But I think she should find out before she sells it. Can I send my appraiser out?" Beth talked to her mother. Margaret was skeptical, but agreeable. She was a practical woman, ultimately. If there was more money on the table, she wanted to know about it. My appraiser, a man named Carl who has been doing commercial valuations for 25 years and who I trust completely, walked the property on a Thursday. He called me Monday morning. 1.2, he said. I held the phone for a moment. "You sure?" "The land alone is worth $800,000 at current comp rates," Carl said. "The structure has value as a going concern. Location is excellent. I'm confident in the number." I called Beth. I said, "Your mother's property is worth approximately $1.2 million. There was a silence on the other end of the line that lasted long enough for me to wonder if the call had dropped. Then Beth said very quietly, "That can't be right." It took 3 weeks to convince Margaret. She was not a suspicious woman by nature, but she'd lived long enough to develop a healthy wariness toward things that seemed too good to be true. $1 million property that she'd been thinking of as a $350,000 property was, in her experience, the kind of thing that turned out to be wrong in some important way she hadn't seen yet. We sat at her kitchen table, Beth, Margaret, and me, and I walked her through it. Comparable sales, zoning, development patterns. The way commercial land in town centers had appreciated over the past decade as suburban sprawl pushed demand back inward. I was patient because I understood what was at stake for her, and also because I'd seen this before. People who have held an asset for a long time often develop an emotional attachment to the number they've always believed, and dislodging that number is more about trust than logic. Margaret finally said, "What if we list it and nobody offers that much?" "Then we learn something," I said. "But I think you'll be surprised." We listed it at $1.15 million. Within 2 weeks, there were 4 serious inquiries. Within a month, there were 3 offers. The bidding moved the way bidding moves when buyers sense real value and real competition. Quickly, upward, with a kind of nervous energy that validates the appraiser's confidence. The accepted offer came in at just under $1.5 million. Margaret wept at the kitchen table when Beth called to tell her. Not dramatic weeping, quiet weeping. The kind that comes when something you didn't let yourself believe turns out to be real. She was going to be okay. Not just okay. She was going to be free. She could travel. She could see her sister in Oregon, who she hadn't seen in 4 years. She could move into that retirement community without counting every dollar. She could stop worrying. The closing was set for the following week. Then the family found out. I want to be precise about the timeline because it matters. The offer was accepted on a Wednesday. By Friday evening, Margaret had made the mistake. And I say this with compassion because she did it out of happiness, not carelessness, of calling her sister-in-law Sandra to share the news. Sandra Harmon was Raymond's daughter-in-law, married to Raymond's middle son, Paul. Paul had never had any ownership stake in the property. But Sandra knew people who did, or who thought they did, or who believed, in that particular way, that family myths calcify into family facts, that they had been owed something they never received. By Saturday morning, Margaret's phone was ringing. By Saturday afternoon, Beth's phone was ringing. By Saturday evening, the family group chat, the one that normally circulated birthday wishes and casserole recipes and the occasional prayer request, had become something else entirely. The grievances arrived in a flood, and they were various, and they were old. There was a cousin, Raymond's brother, Gerald Jr.'s daughter, a woman named Phyllis, who lived in another state and whom nobody had spoken to in years, who believed her father had been wrongly excluded from the original 1961 business arrangement, and that this exclusion had cost their branch of the family a legitimate stake in the property. There was Dale's son, Tommy's older half-brother from Dale's first marriage, a man in his late 60s named Court, who had resurfaced with a lawyer, or so he said, and who believed that the $8,000 his father had received for a 50% stake in a property now selling for $1.5 million constituted fraud, regardless of the fact that the fraud had been committed based on a mutually accepted tax assessment, in good faith, 45 years ago. There was Tommy himself, who was still alive, 71, retired to Florida, apparently comfortable enough, and who called Dennis's widow to say that the $20,000 he'd received for his stake in 1984 was an insult, and that he intended to look into his legal options. And there were others, peripheral figures, spouses of deceased stakeholders, children of cousins, people who had inherited not the property itself, but the story of the property, passed down through family dinners as a symbol of belonging, of lineage, of something they were part of, even if the legal documents didn't reflect it. The calls and messages had a cumulative quality, each one building on the last, the grievances feeding each other, the outrage amplifying in the echo chamber of a family that had, for generations, told itself a story about what it was owed. And at the center of it, the person who had been quietly sitting on a property worth $1.5 million while receiving $5,000 a year and worrying about whether she could afford the retirement community, was Margaret Harmon, 67 years old, who had done nothing wrong and who was now being made to feel like she had. I am not a lawyer. I want to be clear about that. But I've been in property long enough to understand how these situations generally play out. And I made some calls over that weekend. The short version is this. The family's legal claims range from extremely weak to entirely without merit. When Dale sold his 50% stake to Raymond in 1978, he signed a document. He received consideration, money, in exchange for the transfer of his ownership interest. The fact that the property is worth more now than the tax assessment suggested it was worth then does not constitute fraud. A low assessment is not a misrepresentation. It is a public record that any party to the transaction could have challenged or supplemented with an independent appraisal. Neither party did. The transaction was legal. It is done. When Tommy sold his stake to Dennis in 1984, the same logic applies. Dennis paid him more than the assessment-based value. Tommy accepted. The transaction was legal. It is done. The claims being made now that somehow the current sale price retroactively converts past transactions into fraudulent ones rest on a misunderstanding of both contract law and the nature of property markets. Value changes over time. A house sold in 1970 for $30,000 and now worth $800,000 does not entitle the seller's heirs to the appreciation. That is not how property rights work. The lawyer I spoke to put it plainly. They can file whatever they want. They won't win, but they can make the next year very unpleasant for your girlfriend's mother while they try. That was the real threat. Not legal liability, delay, harassment. The weaponization of grief and perceived injustice through a legal system that doesn't care about your emotional reality, only your evidentiary one. The closing was in a week. Margaret's attorney was confident it would proceed. But the family's threats created anxiety, and anxiety has its own costs. It was a Sunday night. We'd been on the phone with her mother, then with Beth's sister Carolyn, then with Margaret's attorney. By the time we hung up for the last time, it was past 11, and we were both exhausted in the particular way that comes not from physical effort, but from hours of managing other people's fear. We were sitting in Beth's living room. She had a glass of wine. I had nothing. There was a silence between us, and I was trying to read it. Whether it was the comfortable silence of two people who've been through something together, or the loaded silence of something waiting to be said. She said it. I keep thinking, Beth began carefully, in that voice she uses when she's been rehearsing something in her head, that things might have been simpler if you hadn't brought up the appraisal. I looked at her. If Mom had just listed it for $350,000, she continued, the family never would have found out there was more. She would have gotten some money, moved to the retirement community, been happy. Nobody would be calling her and threatening to sue. She wouldn't be crying every time she picks up the phone. I sat with this for a moment. I wanted to be careful, not because I was unsure of what I believed, but because I understood what she was doing. She was processing fear and helplessness by looking for a decision that could have prevented it. And the most recent decision, the most visible lever in the story, was mine. Beth, I said, your mother would have sold a $1.5 million property for $350,000. She would have been happy. She would have been robbed, just not by strangers. Beth didn't answer. The family was always going to have feelings about this property, I said. Those feelings existed before I sent Carl out there. The only thing that changed is that your mother now has enough money to protect herself from those feelings. She can hire an attorney. She can wait them out. She can do all of that and still retire comfortably and travel and visit your aunt in Oregon. If she'd sold it for $350,000, she wouldn't have had that cushion. She also wouldn't have a family threatening to sue her, Beth said quietly. Beth, they were never her family. They were people who wanted a piece of something they hadn't touched in decades and wouldn't have come looking if the number had been small enough not to bother. This was harsh, and I knew it. And I watched her face process it. "That's not fair," she said. "They feel like they lost something. They feel like they lost something because they thought they owned something they didn't own," I said. "Tommy signed away his stake in 1984. Dale signed away his in 1978. The feelings those people have about this transaction are real, but they are not legal claims, and they are not your mother's responsibility." Another silence. Then Beth said, "You're not wrong. I just needed someone to be upset at." "I know," I said. "It's not you," she said. "I know that too," I said. "But it's okay if it needed to be me for a little while." She set down her wine glass. She looked at me for a long moment, the way people look at each other when they're deciding whether to be grateful or angry, and finally landing somewhere between the two. "She would have sold it for $350,000, Beth said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact she was letting herself hold for the first time. "She would have sold it for $350,000, I confirmed, and spent the rest of her life thinking she'd done well. It happened on a Thursday, 10 days after the offer was accepted. I drove Margaret to the title company's office because Beth had a work conflict she couldn't rearrange, and because Margaret asked me to, which meant something. She wore a blue dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion and spent the drive talking about her sister in Oregon, about the last time she'd visited, 15 years ago, about how her sister's grandkids were old enough now to take hiking, about a restaurant they'd always meant to try. She didn't talk about the family. She didn't talk about the lawsuit threats, which had quieted without going fully silent, the way fire gets when you stop feeding it. She didn't talk about Tommy or Court or Phyllis or the group chat, which she'd quietly left 2 days earlier. She signed the documents with a steady hand. The title officer, a woman about Margaret's age who had clearly done this 10,000 times, walked her through each page with the professional patience of someone who understood that the paperwork was not the point, that the point was sitting across the table from this older woman in a blue dress who was about to become, in the most practical sense, free. When it was done, Margaret sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she looked at me and said, "Gerald Sr. bought that building for $4,200. Did Beth tell you that?" "She mentioned it," I said. "He was so proud of it," she said. "He drove Dennis past it when Dennis was little, pointed at it, said, 'That's ours.' Not mine. Ours. He meant the family." I nodded. "I think he would have been happy today," she said. "I think he would have understood that the family is Beth and Carolyn. That's who's left. That's who showed up." She smoothed her dress. "The others, they showed up for the money. Gerald would have known the difference." We had lunch after. She ordered a glass of white wine, which she almost never does at midday, and she told me about the retirement community she was going to move into. The garden plots, the pool, the Thursday night movie screenings. She told me about a trip she was planning to the Pacific Northwest. She told me at one point that she hadn't felt this light in years. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. I just listened. The way you listen when someone is telling you who they're going to be, now that they've been given permission to be it. I've thought about this a lot since the closing. About what the story actually is, underneath the drama of the appraisal and the family implosion. Here it is. A family created wealth in 1953 and spent 70 years failing to recognize it. Not because they were stupid, not because they were negligent, exactly, but because they made a category error that is extremely common and almost never discussed. They confused an administrative number, the tax assessment, with an economic one, the market value. And once that confusion became family tradition, it became invisible. It was just how things were done. The assessment was the number. The number was the truth. The consequence of that error played out across multiple generations. When Dale sold his stake for $8,000 in 1978, he sold a fraction of something worth far more. When Tommy sold for $20,000 in 1984, same story. They didn't know. Nobody told them. They couldn't see what they couldn't see. And here is where I want to be clear about something that might be uncomfortable. The fact that they couldn't see it doesn't create a debt. The market value of a property is not a secret that the buyer is obligated to share with the seller. The seller has the right and the means to obtain an independent appraisal before any transaction. Dale and Tommy did not do that. Raymond and Dennis did not encourage them to. Everyone used the assessment because everyone had always used the assessment, and nobody questioned it. And that is a failure of information, not a moral crime. The people now claiming they were defrauded are claiming something that requires the past to be rewritten in light of the present. They are saying, now that we know the property was worth more, the transactions that happened at the old price were wrong. But that's not how value works. The property being worth $1.5 million today does not mean it was worth $1.5 million in 1984. The market in 1984 was different. The development patterns were different. The comps were different. The world was different. What they are actually angry about, if they would sit with it honestly, is that they made decisions without full information, and they cannot accept that this is a condition of being human rather than evidence of someone else's wrongdoing. Beth and I are fine. I want to say that because the internet has a tendency to take a complicated human moment and demand a clean resolution. Either the relationship survived and everything is beautiful, or it didn't, and the lesson is about red flags. Reality is less legible than that. We had a hard 2 weeks. She was processing something enormous. Not just the money, but the shape of her family. The discovery that people she loved were capable of behaving in ways she hadn't expected. The grief of watching her mother be harassed during what should have been a moment of relief. She needed somewhere to put that. And occasionally I was the nearest available surface. But she was honest with herself about it, which is not a small thing. She said eventually that she knew the appraisal was the right call. She said she was glad I'd pushed for it. She said watching her mother at that closing table in that blue dress, with that look on her face, was one of the things she would remember most from this whole period. Margaret is moving into the retirement community in the spring. She's already planning the Oregon trip, booked a flight for July, bought hiking boots that her sister's grandkids will think are extremely cool. She calls Beth every Sunday, and she sounds consistently like someone who has set down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. The family's legal threats have not materialized into anything. The lawyer I spoke to was right. The claims have no merit, and without merit, they tend to dissipate when the steam runs out. Tommy called once more, left a voicemail that Margaret did not return. Court's lawyer, it turned out, was not a real lawyer, but a neighbor who had looked some stuff up. Phyllis sent a letter that Margaret's attorney read and filed and never mentioned again. The building on Callaway Street is under new ownership. The shipping and printing franchise renewed its lease with the new owners and is still there. Still faded green awning, still easy to walk past without seeing. Gerald Harmon Sr. bought that building for $4,200 in 1953 because he believed in bricks over banks. He was trying to build a foundation for his family. He did, actually. He just couldn't have known it would take 70 years and one appraiser named Carl to find out how deep that foundation went. The number, when it finally came, was $1,487,500. Not the tax assessment, not the price anyone in the family had ever imagined, the actual number. The one the market assigned to a piece of land that a man bought with rail yard wages and carpenter's savings because he wanted to give his family something solid to stand on. He did. It just took the right question to find it.